Hey guys, Brangay Realness here with my second video, and today I'm going to be talking about why is South Asian history so complicated. So to give you a little bit of context, I've been studying South Asian history since I think I was about 8 or 9. So the internet came out around when I was like 6, and the first kind of like searchable internet, I guess, I was introduced to when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And being a young child, I think I was the only Hindu in my elementary school of about like 300 students. And I think I was like one of like three brown people. Once those older kids had graduated and my cousins had gone to a different school, I think I was like one of two in the entire school. So I was always like and like a lot of this, we sat between two Baptist churches. So there was a lot of like very heavy Christian influence. And a lot of that like stigma of like associated with Abrahamic culture like got put into me just through like school and absorption and stuff like that in media. So I really like was like kind of starving for some like Hindu influences. So like I remember when I was about 8 is when I really started like liking mythology, but like Greek mythology and Chinese mythology, because there was two books in our library, and that's kind of what like introduced me to and Egyptian mythology, three books, sorry, illustrated myths for each of those cultures. And it was the first time that I, as like being raised as a polytheist and not an Abrahamist, and like was able to kind of like have some parallels drawn between my culture and like visually and having like things to be able to associate with it that I could contextualize and understand. So since then is when I started studying South Asian history, and being like a Indo-Fijian gay person, it's like there's a lot of nuance to my culture. And so studying South Asian history, I found that is really like pejorative and denigrative, and a lot of it was still just continuing things from outside sources. So like at the start of the internet, really like most of the academic stuff that was put on was like stuff from like in on Indology, for example, was like stuff put out by obviously the major authors and like their works, but stuff going back like to the British eras, for example, because that was like really like one of the few like where a lot of the sourcing for Indology started to come from. So I was like, you kind of reading all of this, you kind of like get like an inbuilt like self-hate, almost like a devaluing of yourself and your role in like society and stuff like that. And a lot of what was being presented to me from academia was very different from what I had started to know from like my own sources from like the age of like 8 to 15, like researching the internet and stuff like that, being an internet native. And so I really started to go into like the research of like, okay, where does all this come from? So I started to do my research into Indology, what the perspectives were, but then also starting to find like the other side of the sources. So these would be like characterized as right wing. I think I would call it more of like nationalist, pro-nationalist perspective, right? And we'll get into that in a second. So these were like kind of more in line with what I had actually already been taught through my own sources. And I started to wonder like, why is there such a big difference? And I really started to get into it. So I figured out that like actually South Asian history is really complicated because, you get channels like Cogito, or infographics or things like, or those channels that like try really hard to get a balanced approach to Indian history, but actually tend to continue like it's based on the validity of sources. So to them, Western sources from Western academia are more valid. So they would use those as the kind of definitive correct guide. But a lot of these are antiquated ideas, like old ideas that move these kind of like negative stereotypes about Indians forward and kind of like solidify them. So while they try really hard to be fair and balanced, a lot of their data at the start that they're presenting is biased and coming from a negative perspective. So that's where, and like a lot of times you'll see that people don't really want to engage with studying or talking about India, like or Hinduism on like channels, because they don't have much of a context or understanding. And the people that do generally are like kind of subject to what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So it's like having a little bit of information makes you feel like you're an expert and you know everything. And you'll see this a lot of times when people are talking about caste, when people are talking about the beef issue. So I'm going to be doing a video on the kind of like my definitive guide to understanding what caste is, and kind of my definitive guide to answering why don't Hindus eat beef. Because I was raised in like the Western side of like reading all of these stuff, like even through school and stuff like that, and receiving all of these perspectives in textbooks about India. And on the other side, being exposed to it from the like the own languages, being able to understand them in their internalized sources, but also being Fijian, so having like a bit of a removal from what Indian nationalist identity was, being Fijian Indian born in Canada. And first generation Canadian, but my parents came so young that they might be considered the first generation. So yeah, so why is South Asian history so complicated? So South Asian history really, like the Western interpretations of South Asian history really start to come in the roots of like the Christianization movement and proselytization from Europe into India around the 1600s, particularly in South India by a guy called Roberto Nobili. In the north, you started to have interactions through the Silk Road trade routes, and that was where Dara Shikoh, for example, had copies of the Gita and the Bhagavad Gita and Panchatantra translated into Persian, and then sent out to, and he had translated into a few languages and sent them out to a bunch of like different libraries and stuff like that, and tried to spread that. In southern India, you had this Jesuit missionary Roberto Nobili, who in conversations with the church basically said that the only way to break the Indians of the superstitious habits of their demonic religion would be to modernize Christianity to come in to be used in like an Indian approach. So basically saying like, let's take a look at Indian culture, let's destabilize what they say about their religious systems, and then co-opt them onto ours and just, like make them comfortable. So for example, this would include like putting a mala on the cross, lighting diya. This also included like the Christian missionaries, dressing up as Hindu sages and saints and stuff like that. Or for example, you had things like the Ishopanishad, which was like a false translation of like one of our Upanishads said to have like predicted Christ, and that this was the definitive guide about Brahman and everything. And the unfortunate part is that Abrahamic thought in comparison to Dharmic thought is a little bit more shallow and a little less evolved, and that's partially because of the age as well. So we're getting into that. So that's really when you started having this idea of like, let's analyze Indian culture from the Western side. Let's analyze Indian culture and piece it apart into very breakable stereotypes that we can mimic. We don't have to understand them. We can mimic them and then use that as a way to gain Christians in India. So from the 1700s to the 1800s, there was like a persistent idea and like a very prominent idea that emerged around like the nobility, that was that if any new idea or discovery was first categorized by a Christian in the West, then it would be counted as new. So you could have any idea or thought from the colonies, but if it was in its own language, if you translated it into a European language and you were a Christian, it was thought that you discovered that. And that was the same thing with like lands, right? So if you went to a land and the people weren't Christian, then it was thought that the Christians discovered it, so it was new. So up to about the 1830s, there was about like a concurrently popular idea particularly in Britain and Germany, that culture and religion and all that language, everything had come out of India. And this changed with the discovery of Troy. So when Henrik Schliemann discovered Troy, they were trying to get all of these symbols, like understand them in like one unified way. So the Abrahamic perspective is that there's only one single objective truth, and that having access to that truth makes you right. So this kind of pervades all the way into science, that there's only one objective truth that can be known, which leaves out which is counter to Indian logic. Can get into that in another way. So they found things like the solar cross, things like that, and that matched cultures in Ireland, that were in Greece, that were in Troy, that were also in India and Tibet. So they tried to create this unifying idea, and that's where the idea of the Aryan race started. And it basically was saying that like there was a group of white people in the Caucasus, and that they went and conquered everybody else. And that was why colonization was okay, because these colonies were just continuing what the perfect Aryans had done. So the Indians were the non-perfect Aryans, and the white people were the perfect Aryans that continued the Proto-Indo-European language, blah, 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 blah. That were more religious, that created the Vedas, etc. This was their idea, because this is where the start of co-opting of culture starts. So that was actually on the scientific side, not necessarily the religious side. It was co-opted by like by the religious people to continue their Christianization efforts. But in the religious side, you had this idea that was called the Hamitic hypothesis that came around from the 1600s. Basically, it goes that after Noah landed on the ground, his three sons, Ham, Japheth, and Shem, all separated and went their different ways. Japheth came to Europe, and he was the natural ancestor of all the Europeans. Shem went to the west, and he was the natural ancestor of all the Semitic people. Shem, Semitic, and Ham went to the south and became, or sorry, Shem went to the east. Ham went to the south and became the dark people. And there's a concurrent myth going on with there that Noah had cursed Ham to have his children always and forever be servants. And then after that, you had Ham's son, who was supposedly Noah, and who supposedly was Cain and Abel, was a descendant of Ham. And Cain, I think, something like that. And Cain had the mark of the devil, which was also interpreted at that time to be dark skin. So you had this rise of this idea in Europe itself, saying that, you know, as Christians, as white people, we are actually the descendants of the perfect people, and all of these people, while still human, deserve to be Christianized so they can be brought back. And then through that, you had this kind of idea that slowly transformed from something that was like enlightened despotism, right? And became this idea of like, no, these people cannot be saved. They were forever cursed. So they are always going to be a lower position. And you see this idea still continue today in some German versions of the Bible that are read by Hutterite, Mennonite communities that still say that the mark of Cain was darkened skin. Which like I've experienced myself, having worked in Southern Alberta doing some traveling sales shows. You can definitely tell when people give you like a very weird look seeing you and just like take their distance. And then it's very particular people, and you can tell by their dress and clothing, like what community they come from, and you have to study culture and behavior, otherwise you just think it's stereotypes. So anyways, this idea of the Aryan race turned into the idea of the Aryan migration theory, or turned into the Aryan invasion theory in India. And then when the invasion theory was more or less debunked, it became the migration theory. And now the migration theory is more or less debunked as well. And this as well created this idea of the Proto-Indo-European language groups. So the PIE language groups is actually the scientific continuation of a very racist idea that basically said that Sanskrit was, so initially you had Brits saying that Sanskrit was like the mother of all languages. I don't know how much I would believe that as well either. I think language has been around for many millennia, right? But then what you had them saying was that using this PIE language, they were trying to destabilize any type of like socio-political or cultural advancements in Indian society and placing them outside, saying that like, no, you guys are just like stupid dark people, but we brought it to you and we gave you like, you know, your culture, we gave you all this shit, which is patently false archaeologically. But you had this creation of these ideas on multiple levels and within multiple groups in institution, government, and commerce, that promoted a secondary position of Indians, a kind of like self-hating idea that these were people that deserved to be conquered. Their culture, while it seems great, is actually very backwards and very old, which again is patently false, based on archaeological evidence today. And so you had this Hamitic hypothesis placed into this intellectual framework of Abrahamic thought. So if you remember from my last video, Abrahamic thought and then atheism out of that is literally just a denial of like the Abrahamic perspective, which is still very racist because it says, or not racist, I guess it's xenophobic, because it places every other culture that is non-Abrahamic as still less than the Abrahamic culture, right? Without recognizing that they're mutually distinct and equal cultures. Abrahamic thought and Dharmic, but also Taoist, Shen, animist, you know, African traditional religion, the Southern American religions, the Native American religions, the Siberian religions, the Sami people, basically discounting all of these people. So to combat Christianization, around the 1830s to the 1870s, there was the rise in India of the nationalist movement, who used World War II as a political tool to try and force the British out of India. So and they used a lot of like rallying symbols. So a lot of you, so the British were like pretty bad people, dude. These are cultural myths that are passed on, that like when the Christians would come to build wells to like for communities, they would throw beef or pork into them so that the well would be polluted. And the only way that you could really drink from the well would be to become a Christian or a Hindu or Christian, and disregard Islam and Hinduism. So around this time, the Catholic Church started to promote the idea of the Dravidians as a separate group of people that were the ones that were conquered and pushed down and out by the Aryan race, which again is like patently false based on many, many levels of like archaeological and linguistic research. Combined at this time, there was also the fallout from the Goan Inquisition. So the Goan Inquisition ended around 1820, but I think there was something around like 70,000. Basically, I think it ended 1812. Basically, when the Goan Inquisition ended, the Portuguese burned all of the records. So there's no idea of how many people that actually were, but it was actually more ridiculously worse than your Inquisition in Europe. I think maybe 12 people died in your Inquisition in Europe or something like that. There was 60,000 people imprisoned and 164 people killed in the Goan Inquisition that have records. And this is after the Portuguese tried to destroy everything. And so basically this created a set of Europeanized homegrown intellectuals, and this happened in the British side as well, and in the Dutch and French controlled colonies, of internal sources that didn't have an affinity with their natural culture. And you can see these in stories, for example, like of the kids that were adopted by Queen Victoria from I think it was Sophie Singh and Dalip Singh are the princess and prince that were adopted and basically taken as hostage, taken as hostage, political hostages, and were forced to live and learn in Europe. It's quite a sad story. So around the 1870s, there was the start of like the Indian cultural renaissance. You had Hindu intellectuals that were educated by European standards, but also started to talk about their own history and take an examination of their own history and archaeological research and apply their own interpretations to these and their culture. They offered kind of a studied counter opinion. So they basically recreated the Western academia, but like with an Indian nationalistic perspective. So essentially, much of their method was to create like a counter narrative to stop cultural destabilization that was actually promoted through institutional power structures in Europe. So government, finance, and academia. So for example, like if you wanted to get a job in a bank, say Bank of Baroda or something that was like owned by the British East India Company, I think, or something. This is just an example. If I had better sourcing, I don't have the sourcing for that right now. I can resource it. I'm sorry, or do an apology video. But you would have to be like a Christian, and most of those jobs would go to like people like Parsis, Christians, or Jews, because they were seen as like a step above the kind of like crazy Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists that were superstitious and wore weird clothes. So this created multiple sets of narratives starting in the 1870s, that created multiple sets of narratives of what Indian history and Indian culture was. So you started to, around that time, get like a lot of Marxist-Leninist ideas feeding into Europe as well after the 1880s, into India from Europe after the 1880s, 1890s. And it was still, and so both of these ideas, both of these kind of like narrative sides were still heavily biased by caste and like the Heimat, so where the Vedas came from. So you had on the nationalist side, you had things like Satyarth Prakash, Tilake, Ambedkar. On the Marxist side, or like the Christian, really at this time it would be the Christian and British side, was that the Vedas came with the Mitanni people, or that the Mitanni people were a separate group around the Indians. And the people from the Caucasus, the Aryan race, came in and brought the Vedas, brought the horse, all around like 1500 BC. And this created a distorted timeline in South Asian culture because they were applying the Western European idea of time that continued from, I think, about the 1500s. So they only thought that the world went back to about 4400 BC. So anything Indian, which in Indian timescales are huge in our literature sources, to them, it was all falsehoods, lies, and that's where this idea of like lying Indians used to come from. Indians lie about their cultural history, or we exaggerate and things like that. And they placed all of these ideas into a period of 1700 to 1500 after the Aryans came, which like slowly started to get destroyed by archaeological evidence. And around the 1920s, there was the start of the really forceful protests to quit India during World War II. So this caused multiple factions and rifts within the movement, and then different groups with different leaders or people moving outwardly to different groups for support. So you had, for example, Bose, that was like quite well known to have been in contact, I guess, with Hitler, which is part of some of the ideas which were translated into the creation of the Hindutva movement. You had Nehru, who was like more in line with the communist Marxist sides, but still did not really like them, but was more like, and these were the people in the British, so like in Britain, for example, like the unions and stuff like that. And then you had Jinnah, who was more in line with like the Muslim Brotherhood countries. So this is where the creation of Hindutva started around. I think it was Savarkar or Thackeray, but essentially, I'm not sure of this as a fact, but my interpretation of reading all the source material is that the creator of Hindutva must have adopted some ideas of like the nationalist identity from Nazi Germany that were important to creating a national unified identity to move for support to get India to quit the colony itself. And just as a side note, India, when Britain came in the 1770s, their global GDP percent of GDP was 23%. So 23% of the global GDP of the world's GDP was coming from India. After the British left, it was like less than 2%. So the British really screwed over India by basically taking anything of value. So it's very hard to say whether the right wing, whether the right wing of the Indian movement, Quit India movement, was actually sympathetic to Nazism, because as like a whole, most of these people hated white people. But I think it was more just like a borrowing of ideas of how to control people using behavior, right? And like conditioning, somewhat cultish. So post-partition, the drive for a national identity was sparred by like the early economic development of Pakistan. And then along with this in Pakistan, it was kind of a thought that because they had a unified identity, that they were able to just kind of like skip forward a few steps and drive towards a national economy, whereas India still had a very fractured sense of national identity. You had multiple communities based on tribe, caste, sect, even like economic status, things like that. And so these were severely divided people. So these divisions were basically starting to become more and more severe in the move forward for a national identity, and particularly along language as well. So in the 1950s, you had R.C. Majumdar write a book called The History and Culture of the Indian People. So it's a massive book. I think even reading the whole thing would take you multiple years. I think it's 25 volumes. I've read about it, and I actually haven't been able to procure a copy anywhere. Otherwise, I would definitely try to read it. But once I can get my hands on a set of the volume, then I definitely will. But it's also like 25 volumes. That'd be fucking expensive. Sorry. So this was a very and it's still considered a very studied and well understood and studied and well explained understanding of Indian culture and history that uses a lot of archaeological evidence and challenges, but not in an aggressive way, but challenges the kind of like ideas that were sticking around at that time about what it was to be Indian. So this idea of Indian history competed with the opposing perspectives as well. So there was the Hindutvas that liked some parts and didn't like some parts, and there was the Marxists that said, aha, this proves us on some parts, and that the other part said no, you're just lying. And at a time when Pakistani historians were writing about their conquerors as their cultural heroes, the Indian national drive for identity was by looking at the people that either fought the conquerors, so from the right wing, or from the Marxist perspective, what was called the subaltern perspective, the Dalits. So this created political tensions and multiple perspectives on national identity, and the main point of trying to create a national identity was to combat communalism. It actually created a more stratified communalistic community in my sense from like the 1950s until the 1980s, maybe 1990s, 2000s, who knows? It's still quite stratified, right? So what are these two perspectives? So I think I told you a bit about the Hindutva perspective. That was more about like taking archaeological evidence, offering a studied perspective and interpretation that would counter the European narrative. And then you had the Marxist perspective. So Marxism is based around the subaltern. Marxist history is based around the subaltern perspective. Basically continuing this idea from Lenin and Marx about the proletariat being the underclass and needing to like fight to move forward. And so they created this kind of like contrived, very rigid hierarchy, and a very pejorative view, and like placed, and very rightly so, placed the Dalits and the Harijans and people at the bottom. But I'll get into another video about why caste is way more complicated than I think people want to understand. Not to talk about like, not to diminish anything that is the truth about caste-based violence and caste problems, like that's its own discussion, but I think you guys deserve a better context. So around that time, around the 1970s now, we start to see a solidification of the Aryan invasion as like the main narrative of India. And this pushes forward a lot of like internal timelines, several thousand years to the 1700s to 1500s BC. And this really started to build like a self-flagellating perspective of Hindus and Hinduism. And I'll be honest, like reading these things, it made me feel terrible to be a Hindu compared to the sources that I had known as well. And then as well, there was not a lot of recognition about the impact of the Muslim invasions from 900 to 1300, and then the impact of the Muslim empires like Jizya, etc., from 1300s to 1800 with Aurangzeb and everything, 1700s with Aurangzeb and everything. So there was a complete denial and almost like a defactualization of like the role that these people had played as well. And this is not to be like super diminishing to them. I'm just saying like take a complete look at the history. So when for example, their books written in their own words by their court historians started to become translated, it was very hard to call them, you know, national heroes, for example, when really their main goal, they always saw themselves as outside and above, and that these people needed to be taught a very kind of like violent, virulent lesson about adopting Islam. And being subjugated underneath these Mughal emperors. So in Europe at that same time, it kind of like started to get adopted, this Marxist perspective started to get adopted to continue this idea of like the noble savage. And India was kind of shut out of like the global stage for quite a while because of this idea of non-alignment in the Western kind of Cold War between Russia and the US. And essentially India said like, you guys do you, we'll do us, and we're not going to be between anyone. Russia was like, okay, sweet, we'll still buy your stuff. The US basically sided with Pakistan, which made them promote a more pro-Pakistani reading of history, which was also in line with the Marxist-Leninist reading of Indian history into the Western academia, right? And then as well, you had these media perspectives that were influenced by this pro-Pakistani kind of like media machine around like the 1970s. So it was more has to do with like global trade and like global influence, right? And like when you're talking about like trade partners, things like that. I'm not saying this is definitive. I'm literally just saying like, I'm trying to give you guys a perspective, like Google this shit. There's a lot to read it, and like, let's talk. So this basically created like a circling way of like having these like kind of false narratives about India in the academia being verified by academia. So for example, someone writes a paper on something that someone else wrote and says, and their paper holds it as true. So that validates the paper before it, which validates the paper before it and the research before it, which is part of one of the issues with academia, because sometimes it can just take one camel to sometimes it can just take one straw to break the camel's back. Sorry, fuck. So this basically created this Western legitimization of the Marxist academia. And my personal experience growing up was being taught very dismissive, self-hating ideas. Even in our textbooks, for example, there was, I think, one paragraph in my grade 8 social studies textbook in Canada that said, basically it said caste, cows, and curry. Like literally that was it. And that's kind of the media perspective that's been about India from as I've been reading all of these articles, I've literally, I think, read almost every single article about India from 1990 to 2006, 2007, because these were like all printed. These were easily findable and researchable, like when I was growing up and like searching stuff about India on the internet. And most of these like boiled it down to caste, cows, and curry, and always took that as like a definitive, major defining view. Whatever, even if it was like an economic and business article, and there was absolutely nothing about caste, cows, or curry in there. It was always very reductive in that same way, and always about polytheism as well. So that's where you saw like around the 2000s of like what caused like around 2010 why Modi, for example, gained such a big perspective. Because when you have 80% of a country being taught to hate itself, obviously they're going to be like, screw this guy, we want to love ourselves. And this is where you see this idea of like fascism and nationalism start to rise. So kind of combined with like my teenage rebelliousness, and like delegitimizing your parents and saying, no, I'm gonna like, you're wrong, I'm gonna like learn and like find out myself, and then being like, oh shit, like they're actually right. You know, you kind of go through this natural self-explorative thing and saying like, okay, what is sources, what is discernment, and how do I still try and find myself in my identity with what's given to me? So then around 1987 or 1988, there was a book called The Eminent Historians made by this investigative journalist named Arun Shourie. And basically it confirmed exactly what I was just talking about, that there was a very strong, virulent, kind of like polemical look at Hindus in relation to the history, and this was kind of like managed by a very small group of academics that were held as like the preeminent historians on India and Hinduism, etc. Most of them not practicing Hindus, most of them raised in the British method, many of them not actually speaking any Indian languages or Sanskrit in general, and not really being able to offer any archaeological interpretations, any archaeological evidence for their interpretations of culture and history. Generally speaking, because of their Marxist-Leninist perspective, they were anti-religion, right, in general, but they were also pro-subaltern, which means that like, and also being like kind of like a leftover from Abrahamic thought, they obviously still promoted all of these ideas of Abrahamic thought and like kind of like, I don't know, I guess what you'd say, Abrahamic thought and superiority over the crazy superstitious Hindus who are a little bit less educated, because in their mind, the hierarchy was Marxists, communists, who were socialists and like pro-proletariat, and then Christians, Abrahamics, who were somewhat like that, and then beneath that was like the casteist evil Hindus. So there was like multiple things that basically ended up happening around the same time. So you had you had Ayodhya happen, so the wrecking of the Babri Masjid. You had Godhra happen around 2000. You had the 10th anniversary of the Kashmiri Pandit pogrom. So the mass exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits that was not talked about at all in Western media, maybe in two sources I remember reading about it at the time, but it wasn't actually mentioned at all much until about the 10th anniversary. Even so, it's very rarely spoken about in Western sources, in Western media. And then also with the availability of the internet, a lot of diaspora South Asians started to realize that Western media was actually extremely pejorative, and there was a reasoning behind it. And it was very reductionist, basically going down to caste and cows. So the rise of Modi and the unsealing of the Ayodhya verdict, which actually showed that the counter narrative was actually correct, is really what spurred this idea of like the nationalist drive in history. So people would want to say like there's a left and a right. Actually, in history at this time, I think you have what's called the Marxist perspective, which is very pejorative of Indian culture and Hindus. And then you have and places a lot of it on the outside of India. It doesn't really place much on the inside of India, unless it's like pretty bad. And then you have the nationalists who say that we're creating a more archaeologically verified in the literature, based on literature, archaeoastronomy, things like that, and archaeology that are creating a more unified identity. And then you have people in the middle that are centrist, that take a little bit from column A and a little bit from column B. So personally, I was an internet Hindu at the start of the 2010s. I think I was actually probably in the lead of this on one website, especially. Multiples actually, but I would basically search Hindu, and any article that came up on Hinduism from about 2008 to about 2013-14, I was doing this. I would always leave a comment basically picking apart what was wrong with their perception and interpretation. And after that, I noticed about 2015, like nobody does anything on India. And I kind of have to be like, okay, I'm glad for the internet Hindus that like I kind of helped spur it on. But at the same time, I'm like, no guys, like this isn't correct. If we're going to like have a studied discussion and debate, then we need to understand all sources and perspectives, because history is not objective fact. History is subjective fact by whoever's written by whoever's in power. But the problem was that around the 2010s, you started to see these global issues. So for example, you had clothing companies using Hindu imagery on like very, very derogatory ways. So on sandals or on bathroom mats or something like that. You had the California and Texas textbook crises, which really like created these self-hating narratives about Hinduism that are not based in archaeology. So you are essentially teaching colonial behavioral thought if you're not teaching what the archaeological interpretations about the archaeology say. So around that time, you had this guy named Dick Teresi that created this book called Lost Discoveries, Ancient Origins of Modern Science. And it really took like a studied perspective into like what was science and where it came from pre-Greeks. So kind of destabilizing this idea in Western centralism, Eurocentralism, that Greece was like the be-all end-all place for science and philosophy to have started from, which is patently false. And so this created competing narratives in Western histories about engineering, mathematics, herbal sciences, medicine, and their origins, about where they lie, or what the reality would be about India. So once Modi kind of opened the floodgates, now you have like a very large counter academia that is starting to create this narrative that actually, based on archaeological evidence and kind of conjecture and correlation, might seem more accurate to some things. But you'd have to go and look at that. So hope this was helpful, guys. I know it was a little long, but my next videos will be shorter. I just need context on shit, right?